The wing part, suspected of belonging to that missing Malaysian Airlines jet, is now in a lab for analysis. Officials are increasingly sure this is part of the fatal Malaysian Airlines plane that disappeared 16 months ago without a trace. On the night of March 8, 2014, a Malaysia Airlines flight carrying 239 people vanished into thin air. No Mayday, call no wreckage, nothing, just silence. For over 10 years, experts have spent more than $200 million scanning the ocean floor and still came up empty. But now a retired British engineer, Richard Godfrey, claims he's cracked the code using faint, nearly invisible radio signals that nobody else thought to check. Some scientists call it impossible. Others are stunned. If he's right, we finally know where MH370 lies. So what did he find? Can this new method hold up under scrutiny? And is the wreckage really there? Let's dig in. The night the plane vanished. You may know the story of MH370, or at least you think you do. The plane takes off, flies into the night, and then gone. But the truth is the version most of us have in our heads barely scratches the surface. What really happened that night is way more complex, way more chilling, and honestly, it raises more questions than answers. Let's rewind. It was March 8th, 2014. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370A. Boeing 77 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur just after midnight, 12:41 in the morning to be exact. The plane was packed with 239 people, business, travelers, tourists, and entire families, heading to Beijing. For the first half hour or so, everything looked boringly normal. Smooth climb, routine chatter with air traffic control, nothing that would have raised an eyebrow. And then came the last words anyone ever heard from the cockpit. At 1:19 a.m., the Malaysian controller told them to check in with Vietnam as they crossed into new airspace. The pilot's reply, calm as ever. Good night, Malaysian 370. 2 minutes later, at 1:21, the plane's transponder went dark. That's the device that tells air traffic controllers the plane's ID, altitude, and speed. In other words, the thing that makes it visible on civilian radar. Suddenly, it was gone to the outside world. It looked like the plane had blinked out of existence. But here's the first twist, and it's a big one. The plane hadn't vanished. Not yet. While civilian radar lost it, Malaysia's military radar, which works differently, more like bouncing a flashlight beam off an object and catching the reflection, kept picking something up. An unidentified blip showed up, and investigators later said, yeah, this was most likely MH370. Only now the plane wasn't following its flight path at all. It had made a sharp left turn, not a drift, not a wobble, a deliberate controlled turn. Instead of heading northeast toward Beijing, it swung back west, crossing over the Malay Peninsula right past its own home turf. Then it kept going, flying out toward the Andaman Sea. Military radar tracked it for another hour until 2:22 a.m. when it disappeared off their screens. Northwest of Panang Island. Past that, nothing. Imagine being in that radar room watching the blip, as a passenger jet just walk off the map. No distress call, no squawk code, no explanation, just gone. But here's where things get even stranger. Because while the plane wasn't talking to air traffic control anymore, it was still whispering into space. The aircraft's satellite system, the satellite data unit, had quietly reconnected with an Inmarat satellite orbiting over the Indian Ocean. This wasn't meant for tracking planes. It was just a maintenance handshake, a kind of, yep, still here, ping. But these ghostly signals ended up being the only real evidence of MH370's path for the next 6 hours. There were 7 of those pings in total, and with no black box, no radar, no radio calls, those 7 handshakes became the breadcrumbs investigators clung to, using 2 key pieces of data. The burst timing offset, basically the delay in the signal's round trip, and the burst frequency offset, a tiny Doppler shift in the signal. Engineers tried to map out where the plane had gone. What they got were arcs, enormous sweeping arcs, stretching across the planet. One path pointed north across Asia, the other plunged south into the vast emptiness of the Indian Ocean. The northern route was ruled out fast. Too many radars, too many militaries watching that sky. Somebody would have noticed a rogue Boeing, so all attention went south. That led to what we now call the seventh arc, the final line drawn at 8 to 19 a.m. when the last handshake came in. According to the math, that's when MH370 was most likely ran out of fuel, drifting down somewhere along that lonely curve in the Indian Ocean. And so began one of the biggest, most expensive searches in aviation history. Dozens of ships, planes, and later deep-sea drones scoured an area of 120,000 square kilometers of seabed. That's about the size of Pennsylvania for context. They spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars dragging sonar across the ocean floor. And what did they find? Nothing. Well, not completely nothing. Over time, a handful of pieces of debris washed up. A wing flap in Reunion Island, some interior paneling in Mozambique, more bits in Madagascar, but none of that. Debris gave investigators a smoking gun. No cockpit voice recorder, no flight data recorder, no real answers. The search had hit a wall. The Inmarat math seemed brilliant at first, but if it was so perfect, why did it lead to an empty ocean? That's the question that still haunts people. Something in the official story wasn't adding up, and in the middle of that vacuum, with no clear wreckage, no clear explanation, came a flood of theories. Some wild, some chillingly possible. But one of the most intriguing voices to step into this mystery was Richard Godfrey, the man who says he's figured out where MH370 really is and who stunned the world with his proof. We have oceanography, drift analysis, we have the performance data from Boeing, the story everyone believed but shouldn't have. Here's the thing. When you strip away all the noise, the official story of MH370 is actually kind of simple. Too simple, maybe. In the years after the plane vanished, investigators, media outlets, and even some aviation experts latched onto one explanation. It goes like this. Captain Zahari Ahmed Shah, the 53-year-old veteran pilot with more than 18,000 flight hours, hijacked his own plane. According to this version, he calmly switched off the communication systems, made a sharp U-turn across Malaysia, depressurized the cabin, so everyone else on board passed out, then kept flying south into nowhere for nearly 7 hours. Eventually, when the fuel ran dry, the massive Boeing 7 supposedly slipped quietly into the southern Indian Ocean in what some called a ghost flight or a zombie flight. On paper, it sounds like the kind of chilling story Hollywood might cook up. A respected pilot turning into the villain, carrying 239 people to their deaths. But here's the problem. When you start looking closely at the evidence, this neat little theory falls apart in at least 3 massive ways. Let's start with the satellite data, because that's really the backbone of the whole official theory. Those handshakes MH370, made with the Inmarsat satellite, were used to map its supposed path. But here's where things get messy. The very last set of data around 8:19 in the morning shows something strange. The burst frequency offset, or BFO for short, suggests the aircraft wasn't just gliding down gently like an engine-out airplane trying to ditch safely. Instead, the numbers point to a sharp drop in altitude, a sudden downward acceleration. Think more like a nosedive than a calm glide. In fact, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau's own review of the BFOS in 2016 suggested the jet may have been descending at up to 15,000 feet per minute. That's not a controlled landing. That's falling out of the sky. And that alone makes the pilot's self-harm or fuel exhaustion glide theory very shaky. Then there's the wreckage, or rather the tiny bits of wreckage we actually have. The first confirmed piece was that flaperon found in July of 2015 on Reunion Island off the coast of Africa. Since then, about 3 dozen more fragments, some confirmed, others highly likely, have been recovered along beaches in Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania, Mauritius, and South Africa. A BC's Alex Marquard reports in from Reunion Island, where they found that mystery part. Here's the important part. The flaperon wasn't in a condition you'd expect if the pilot had tried to glide the plane down for a soft ditching. The trailing edge was shredded in a way that experts said looked more like flutter damage, something that happens when a control surface shakes violently in high-speed air. The flaps were also confirmed to have been retracted, meaning the plane was in a cruise configuration not set up for landing. Other pieces told similar stories. A wing flap section discovered in Tanzania showed evidence of fracture from overload, which again points to a violent, high-energy impact. If this had been a calm, intentional water landing, we'd expect the flaps to be extended more intact wreckage and maybe even floating fuselage sections. But instead, the fragments show brute force destruction. And then we come to what might be the biggest flaw of all the search itself. Governments spent hundreds of millions of dollars scouring the Indian Ocean and mapping more than 120,000 kilometers of seabed. But here's the kicker. The entire operation was built on a chain of assumptions. Investigators assumed the satellite pings painted a precise track. They assumed the plane's fuel burn was exactly what the models predicted. They assumed autopilot kept the jet flying straight until the tanks ran dry. And worst of all, they treated the seventh arc like gospel, a narrow line in the middle of nowhere where the plane had to be. But assumptions are dangerous. And as year after year went by with ships towing sonar and underwater drones finding nothing but volcanic ridges and deep trenches, the truth became impossible to ignore. They had been looking in the wrong place. This was a classic case of confirmation bias, believing a theory so strongly that you twist every piece of evidence to fit it. The pilot self-harm story was neat and easy for headlines, but the real evidence was messy and contradictory. So where does that leave us? By the time the official search was suspended in early 2017, people were frustrated, angry, and desperate. Families of the victims still had no answers. Aviation experts admitted they were baffled, and the public was left with a story that didn't add up. If the neat explanation about Captain Zahari wasn't right, then what was? Could the satellite data have been misread? Could the wreckage be pointing to a totally different kind of crash? Or was there another method? Some overlooked piece of technology that could actually track MH370 more accurately than anything the official search teams had tried. That's where Richard Godfrey enters the picture. A retired British aerospace engineer with a taste for puzzles, he decided to take a completely different approach. While governments were stuck staring at satellite pings, Godfrey was asking a question no one else had dared to ask. And his answer would shake everything we thought we knew about MH370. Richard Godfrey's crazy-sounding idea that might not be so crazy. 2 years after people had given up on MH370 ever being found, one man in his 70s sitting quietly in his study was asking himself a question so odd that it sounded like the start of a bad joke. What if a missing plane could be tracked? Not with satellites, not with radar, not even with military tech, but by amateur radio hobbyists tinkering in their garages. That's the kind of question Richard Godfrey, a retired British aerospace engineer, started asking around 2 years after the disappearance. Credible evidence is provided, and the search will resume. While governments were pouring millions into searches that kept turning up nothing but empty ocean, Godfrey wasn't satisfied. He had spent his life solving engineering puzzles, and this was the biggest one he'd ever come across. So he dug into a technology almost nobody outside the ham radio community had even heard of. Something called WSPR. WSPR. Weak Signal Propagation Reporter is a weird little system invented in the 2000s. Basically, thousands of amateur radio enthusiasts all over the world send out tiny whisper-like radio signals every couple of minutes. The signals are ridiculously weak, often less than 1 watt, about the same power as a nightlight. But they can bounce off the ionosphere and travel thousands of miles. Think of WSPR like a giant spiderweb stretched around the whole globe. Each thread is one of those weak signals moving back and forth between 2 stations. Most of the time, it just helps hobbyists figure out how far their signals travel. But Godfrey realized something big. If a huge airplane slices through one of those threads, it leaves a disturbance. It doesn't sound dramatic. It might just be a tiny dip in the signal strength or a little shift in frequency, sometimes less than a single decibel. But those disturbances get logged every single time in an online database called WSPR-net. And that database is huge. Years worth of data. Billions of little tweets from radios all around the world. Godfrey thought if MH370 really flew across the Indian Ocean that night, then it must have crossed dozens of those invisible threads. And if he could find those disturbances, he might be able to map the plane's path like a trail of breadcrumbs. So he rolled up his sleeves and started digging. This wasn't a weekend project. It became his obsession. For 3 years, he combed through the WSPR-net archive, which meant dealing with more than 200 billion lines of raw data. He had to build custom software just to filter out all the false alarms, things like solar storms, background interference, under the normal chaos of the ionosphere. And then slowly, a picture started to form. On the night between March 7th and March 8th of 2014, when the Boeing 77 disappeared, Godfrey found roughly 130 WSPR anomalies over the Indian Ocean. Not random noise, not explainable by weather or radio interference. When he plotted them on a map in the order they happened, they lined up into a track. The track began right where Malaysian military radar had last picked up the plane. From there, it curved southwest, then turned south. Exactly the kind of turn investigators had long suspected, but with far more precision. The trail didn't just fade away, it ended at a very specific spot, 29,128 degrees south, 99,934 degrees east. That's about 1,500 kilometers west of Perth, Australia. Deep water, yes. But still about 200 kilometers inside an area that no official or private search had ever touched. For the first time in years, someone had produced a brand new data-driven location for MH370. Not a vague guess, not another maybe over here. A single point backed up by hard numbers, but numbers aren't enough. Putting the numbers to the test. Numbers on a page are just that, numbers. They don't drag a plane off the ocean floor. They don't give families closure. For Richard Godfrey, the real test wasn't whether he could find patterns in ham radio signals. The real test was whether those patterns could stand up to hard questions from people who didn't care about theories. They wanted proof. That's why he took his findings to the University of Liverpool to a team of analysts who weren't strangers to solving tragedies like this. These were the same experts who had helped track down the wreckage of Air France Flight 447 after it went missing in the Atlantic. The aircraft begins to roll. It begins to go from one side to the other side, back in 2011. If Godfrey's numbers were smoke and mirrors, they'd know instantly. So, what exactly did he put in front of them, and why did it grab their attention instead of ending up in the wild theory pile? Let's break it down. The first piece of the puzzle was what he called the timestamp cross-check. This was basically a reality check. Did the disturbances he found in the WSPR data match up with the actual timeline of MH370's flight? If those radio blips were happening hours before or after the plane's known pings with the Inmarsat satellite, the whole theory would collapse. But the opposite happened. Every single one of the 130 anomalies Godfrey flagged lined up almost perfectly within about 4 minutes of an Inmarsat ping. That's not the kind of coincidence you brush off. That's a pattern. And when investigators looked around for other explanations, maybe another Boeing 77 in the same airspace, maybe a cargo jet passing through nothing fit. No other plane was in that sky. No other plane could have made those ripples. The only candidate left was MH370. Next came the signal geometry. Think of this like replacing a blurry photograph with a sharp one. Inmarsat's satellite data had always been more like a rough sketch than a detailed map. It could only narrow things down to giant arcs, long, vague stretches of ocean hundreds of kilometers wide. Good enough to guess, but not good enough to pinpoint. WSPR changed that game. Because each signal traveled along a specific path between two radio operators, say one in New Zealand and one in South Africa, any disturbance was locked to that path. When several paths showed disturbances at the same time, you could cross them like lines on a map. Suddenly, instead of a search area the size of a continent, Godfrey was drawing corridors only about 20 kilometers wide. The more paths he had, the more precise the trail became. Move forward in the last 6 years. With their technology, we have new research into MH370. Then came the trickiest test, the refraction fingerprint. This was about proving the wiggles in the radio signals weren't just random noise. The ocean surface, the ionosphere, even solar activity could all bend and twist radio waves in ways that looked messy. Godfrey needed to show that what he was picking up was the fingerprint of a huge airplane, not a glitch of nature. He focused on signals in the 14 megahertz range because that frequency reacts in a predictable way, and something as massive as a Boeing 777 cuts across it. To make sure the results weren't junk, his software threw out any faint or muddy disturbances. Only strong hits around. 255 decibels or better made the cut. After running all those filters, he was left with 130 solid anomalies. And here's the kicker. They weren't scattered all over the map. They clustered, forming a line across the southern Indian Ocean, almost like someone had sprinkled breadcrumbs across the water. When the Liverpool team ran the numbers through their own models using Bayesian analysis, the same statistical method that had nailed down Air France 447's location, they came back with something remarkable. Their calculations showed a 74% probability that MH370's wreckage was sitting inside a small patch of ocean centered on Godfrey's coordinates. For the first time since the plane vanished, the data wasn't just hopeful. It was mathematically solid. Now imagine being one of those scientists. You've spent years watching wild theories pop up and burn out. Stolen planes, secret bases, pilot self-harm, even abductions. And then someone hands you a trail of data points that line up almost too neatly to ignore. It wasn't absolute proof, but it was the closest thing anyone had seen since the night the plane disappeared. The pushback against WSPR. Here's the thing about any bold new idea. The moment you put it out there, people are going to push back. That's not a bad thing. It's actually how science is supposed to work. If no one questioned it, that would be even stranger. And with something as haunting and emotionally loaded as MH370, the skepticism was instant and loud. So let's walk through the biggest objections people threw at Richard Godfrey's WSPR theory and how he and others pushed back. The first objection hit almost immediately. WSPR was never designed for this purpose. And you know what? That's true. WSPR, or Whisper, as radio folks call it, was never built to track lost airplanes. It was made for ham radio hobbyists who wanted to bounce signals off the atmosphere and see where they landed. Nothing more. But here's the twist. Science is full of tools being used in ways the inventors never dreamed of. Think about it. X-rays were discovered by accident. When Wilhelm Röntgen was just experimenting with cathode rays back in the late 1800s. Penicillin, total fluke. When Alexander Fleming noticed mold-killing bacteria in his petri dishes in 1928. Even GPS, which we now use to find the closest coffee shop, was originally a military navigation system. So yeah, WSPR. SPR wasn't built to find missing planes, but the physics behind it, the way radio waves bend, scatter, and get messed up when something big slices through them, that's solid decades-old science. Even Joe Taylor, the Nobel Prize winner, who actually invented WSPR, admitted that airplanes absolutely can disturb these signals. He was more cautious about whether you could pin down exact locations, but the basic premise rocks solid. And Godfrey didn't just stop at theory. He went for a real-world test. Last November, his team teamed up with folks at the University of Liverpool and chartered a Boeing 777. They flew it along the very corridor over the Indian Ocean that matched the suspected MH370 route. Meanwhile, WSPR stations around the world were listening. And guess what? Right on cue, the disturbances popped up exactly where the plane was. Not sort of near it. Not vaguely around the same time. No. And the signals of the ham radio operators communicating with each other on the night the plane disappeared. The spikes matched the aircraft's position almost to the minute. That was the smoking gun. Proof that this wasn't just math on a napkin. The system worked in real time. The second objection sounded more like a jab at Godfrey himself. He keeps moving the target. And again, on the surface, that's true. His first calculations years ago pointed to a crash site closer to 33 degrees south. Then it shifted to 34, then finally to 29 degrees south. Critics pounced, saying it looked like guesswork. But here's the thing. In science, changing your answer as you get better data isn't failure, it's progress. When Copernicus first laid out the idea that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, his math wasn't perfect. It took later astronomers refining the data to tighten the model. Same deal here. Godfrey didn't just throw darts at a map. Each shift happened because more WSPR data came online, and because the algorithms analyzing it got smarter. Over time, the area of uncertainty shrank. And here's the kicker. For over 14 straight months, the target hasn't budged from 29 degrees south. That's a huge deal. It means the refinements are over. The model has stopped drifting. That stability is what finally convinced people this wasn't just a moving goalpost. Then there's the third objection, the one nobody can argue away completely. We still haven't found wreckage at that exact spot. Fair point. Until someone actually pulls a wing or a black box off the seabed, it's all still theory. But let's flip it around. Instead of starting with theory, start with the debris we already have. Remember the flaperon that washed up on Reunion Island in 2015? That piece was confirmed beyond a doubt to be from MH370. There are in total 160 of these detections. Later, more debris turned up in places like Mozambique, Madagascar, and Tanzania. These weren't random junk. They were Boeing 77 parts tied directly to the missing plane. So, where did they come from? That's where oceanographers stepped in. At the Geomar Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research in Germany, scientists ran massive drift simulations. They basically dropped virtual message in a bottle trackers into computer models of the Indian Ocean currents and watched where they would wash ashore. They did this hundreds of thousands of times. When they reversed the drift paths from Reunion and the other African coastlines, something remarkable happened. The majority traced back to an origin point within about 100 kilometers of Godfrey's hotspot at 29 degrees south. Not a vague area, not half the ocean, a specific zone. That's the kind of independent confirmation you can't just hand-wave away. So let's sum up. People said WSPR wasn't meant for this. True, but the physics is valid and now tested. People said the crash site kept moving. True, but only because the data got better and now it's locked in. People said no wreckage is there. True, but drift analysis points straight back to that location. Every time an objection is raised, the evidence pushes back harder. And here's where things get really interesting. For the first time in years, this isn't just talk. There's action. The brutal cyclone season in the southern Indian Ocean has wrapped up, which means ships can actually operate out there again. And the heavy hitter is back. Ocean Infinity. If that name rings a bell, it's because they led the massive search effort in 2018. They didn't find MH370 then, but they built up an arsenal of deep sea tech that's only gotten better since. Their flagship is the Armada 7806, a monster of a support ship packed with Hugin autonomous underwater vehicles, basically robotic submarines. These aren't little tethered drones. They can dive 6,000 meters, roam untethered for days, and scan the ocean floor with sonar detailed enough to spot a car wreck under miles of water. And now here's the kicker. Malaysia's government has signed a brand new contract with Ocean Infinity. Malaysia has given its final approval to a new search for the missing flight, MH370 robotics firm, Ocean Infinity. Anthony Locke, Malaysia's transport minister, pushed it through in January of 2025. The search zone, a carefully defined 15,000 square kilometers box, zeroed in on the exact hotspot, identified by the WSPR analysis. The deal is no find, no fee. Translation: Ocean Infinity is paying all the upfront costs, estimated around $70 million, and only gets paid if they actually find the wreck. That alone should tell you something. They wouldn't gamble that kind of money and resources unless they believed the data was strong. Now, let's talk numbers. A single Hugin AUV can cover about 500 kilometers a day, cruising slowly at 3 knots while scanning the seabed with an entire fleet running around the clock. They can sweep the entire search box in about 1 month. Think about that. More than a decade of frustration and dead ends. And now the answer might be less than 30 days away. Once they get underway, the ship is loaded. The robots are ready. The contract is signed. All that's left is for the weather window to stay open long enough for the mission to play out. So here we are. After all these years of heartbreak, wild theories, false leads, and endless speculation, the pieces are finally lining up. Solid data, a defined target, and the tech to get the job done. The question is no longer, can MH370 be found? The question now is, are we finally about to close the book on one of the greatest mysteries of our time? Thanks for watching, fam. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. While you're still here, check out the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you might discover next.